So I'm Suzanne Lovejoy, and I'm the music librarian for access and research services at Yale University in the music library. So one of our great collections is the Charles Ives Papers. And when I first started working in that library 28 years ago, I became the primary person to help researchers use the papers. And because they have a rather idiosyncratic arrangement, I'm still probably the primary person to help people find the music. I've also been supervising the student who has been digitizing the music manuscripts. And this is a project we've been involved in since 2014, probably way too long, but most of them have been digitized, and we can now send digital color copies to researchers. My first encounter with Ives was probably as a college student, and I remember Thomas Hampson coming to sing at my little college in North Carolina, Salem College, which had about 500 women students and a very small school of music. And one of the pieces he sang was Ives' Circus Parade, which is such a great song. So that was perhaps the first thing I knew about Ives. And maybe the second was having to listen to The Unanswered Question, which is a short enough work that's included in a lot of introductory music history classes. So I had certainly heard of Ives' name and knew of his importance by the time I started working at Yale. Having oversight of the papers is not always that easy. I've had the habit of sketching several pieces on the same sheet of paper. So, of course, they are arranged by composition, but when you get to these multi-composition pages, a decision had to be made. And that was all sorted out by John Kirkpatrick back in the 50s and the early 60s, way before I came on the scene. And the work he did organizing and identifying which music was on each piece of paper was truly amazing. There are still, little fragmentary sketches that he didn't identify, but a lot of those are just one chord. So, and we don't really know whether Ives actually used them in something else. It was really a mammoth job, and he was an amazing researcher to have figured all that out. So we just try to keep them in the same order. But every now and then, as a researcher would arrive, they would say that a piece of paper was missing. And then it would be my job to try to figure out where it could be. And usually it was just a matter of consulting Kirkpatrick's catalog and finding out the 3 different pieces that were on that piece of paper and then paging the other boxes and looking in them. We had other issues later on when classes were working with the Ives Papers. Professor Hepikoski, James Hepikoski, who was a very distinguished American musicologist, used to teach a class on Charles Ives, Cole Porter, and the blues to his graduate students in music history. And this was a fabulous combination of topics. But sometimes different works would get put together in one folder and then refiled that way. So there was a scary moment, I recall, when were hard-pressed to find a particular song manuscript. Fortunately, I'd say most of the time we turn up things that had been misplaced rather than lose them again. And nothing's ever really lost. It's just mislaid for a while. At first, it was mostly American students who came to write their dissertations, but we have had researchers come from Germany and the UK. The places in the world where the Ives bibliography or the music catalog has been downloaded. I called up a map and could see every place where copies had been downloaded. And they really span all the continents except Antarctica, which wasn't shown on the map. So maybe there are people in Antarctica not really studying Ives seriously, but they are on every other continent. And that's really quite exciting to see. Some of the things that I've also done as the reference librarian and working in the Ives Papers are to try to identify where a tune is in a particular work. Sometimes those tunes are quite buried in the midst of many other notes. And one of the things that's been interesting to me and made me feel such a sense of kinship, I guess, with Ives is that so many of the tunes that he quotes are 19th century popular songs and old hymns, and these are songs that I learned as a young person. I grew up during the folk song revival, and I had quite a number of songbooks of 19th century songs, such as the Laura Ingalls Wilder songbook, which had a lot of those popular songs. And then my mother had an old hymnal that had belonged to her grandmother, and Jim Sinclair told me that that was the same hymnal that he consulted when he wanted to find the versions of hymns that Ives used. So that's been very interesting as well. John Kirkpatrick was really responsible for over the collection when it first came to Yale. And one of the decisions he made was not to incorporate the correspondence between Charles and Harmony Ives, his wife, into the Charles Ives Papers. He kept them. And it was only after his death that they came to Yale, and now they're an addition to the papers. Vivian Perlis had cataloged all the letters and the writings and in a finding aid back in the early 70s, I think. But those letters were not in there until the 90s. John Kirkpatrick felt very protective of Mrs. Ives and didn't think that things that were so private and so personal should be available to just anybody. I think it was the gift of Mrs. Ives to give the papers to Yale, because this was the school where her husband had gone to college, and because we had music archives already. It certainly was a wonderful gift, and it has made, we have virtually every piece of music Ives wrote, except for, I think, 2 pages of the Browning Overture, which are here in New York at the Pierpont Morgan. But his collection was so intact. He had kept all his music manuscripts. And one of the interesting things that Ives did was, when someone was interested in a piece of music, he didn't just send them a manuscript. He kept the manuscript, but he would take it to a place called the Quality Reprographic Service Office. And they made big full-size negatives of the manuscripts. And then from those, they could produce positive photostats. And a photostat is a sort of an old form of photographic form that's not really used much today. So he then sent photostats out around the world. I found it fascinating that one of his pieces premiered in Havana, conducted by Nicholas Slonimsky, and other pieces he sent to California to people like John Cage and Lou Harrison. Really, and then of course Henry Cowell, some of the most noted American composers of the mid-20th century, were interested in Ives, and he sent them his music pretty freely and supported their work in performing them. And there is a really funny letter from Ives to Slonimsky where he says, "Well, it seems to me that if somebody had the chance to conduct at the Hollywood Bowl, he wouldn't pick a piece of mine." And I don't know if you've heard it, but there is also a recording called Ives Plays Ives. It's just Ives on the piano playing whatever piece somebody asked him to make a recording of, and a woman in New York made those recordings. I can just remember the comments that are shouted along with the recording. One was for Leopold Stokowski, of course, who conducted, I think, the Fourth Symphony. And he says, "Well, I would have thought this was clear," and then he'll play some chords. "Seems clear enough to me." But he played with such gusto that it's really, and he sang along with the songs too. It was during his first year at Yale that his father died, and of course this was a very sad time for him. I have been told, or I've read, that he looked for another father figure in Horatio Parker, who was dean of the School of Music. But Ives' father had also been a musical experimentalist, and Horatio Parker was very conservative. And the two just didn't mesh well. One of the fun things that we found out during my early years at Yale was that we were processing School of Music papers, and we had compositions that had been turned into Professor Parker. And one of them was a fugue by Ives, and it said Fugue in C was the title on the piece. Well, then someone went through the papers to find the sketches for it, and sure enough, they found a sketch, Stupid Fugue on a Stupid Subject. So I think that gives you an idea of what he thought of Parker, but I do think he admired and respected him. He found much more of a mentor in Griggs, who was the choir director at Center Church on the Green. And Griggs had studied music in Leipzig, actually had a PhD. Parker had studied in Munich, so they were both steeped in the German tradition of music. But Ives played the organ at Center Church when he was a student, and I think he became very close to Griggs during those years. So I think he had good times. It's sort of fun to bring out some of the pieces that he wrote. He wrote a lot of songs at Yale. He also wrote a piece called The Yale-Princeton Football Game, and in it he put the flying wedge formation, which was popular in football at the time, and you can see these little wedges of notes at one particular point in the score. David Twitchell was a classmate or fellow student of Ives, and Harmony grew up in Hartford, and her father was a very prominent minister in Hartford and a close friend of Mark Twain's. And apparently the two Twitchell girls were both considered great beauties. He was invited to go home with David at one point and met Harmony, and their friendship developed after that, their relationship. We were able to acquire the letters he sent to Bernard Herrmann, the film composer, some years ago. And it turned out Ives often drafted a letter and then had Harmony or Edith copy it out for him. And he would even draft them in the third person, usually starting with something like, Mr. Ives is not feeling very well today, but he's asked me to tell you this. And so when the Herrmann letters came up for sale, I thought, well, perhaps we've got all of Ives' drafts. But I looked, and in fact, we didn't. We had a summary that a scholar had done at one point, but most of those letters had not been drafted. So that was quite a happy thing to acquire. I got to go to the Ives Vocal Marathon at Wesleyan when that was held, and that was really a marvelous weekend. Lots of Ives songs and lots of scholars and people interested in Ives. And one of the fun things was Helen Boatwright. She was one of the first women to sing some of the Ives songs. And she was there. She lived to be in her 90s. And to hear her speaking to the high school students was, she was such a lively woman, even in her late years. What I'm always amazed at is when people come who are coming to Yale for some other reason and then tell me about how much they love the music of Ives. And I think a few years ago we had a physicist come from California from the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories. And he had taken his son to hear all the concerts at the San Francisco Symphony and was really passionate about Ives' music, and he knew the music better than I did. So that was fun. It's also, every now and then a researcher comes and I'll have the opportunity to show them around Yale and New Haven and point out some of the buildings that are important in the Ives history. Ives was a student from 1894 to 1898. And at the time, the music building was on Old Campus. It was called the Old Treasury Building, I think, but it has since been torn down. Yale's had a lot of renovations since then. But one of the oldest buildings on Old Campus is Connecticut Hall. It's a brick building in the Federal style. And that, during Ives' day, was called South Middle. And Ives' dormitory room was in that building. So, and then Center Church is still on the Green. There are 3 churches on the Green. The one in the middle is Center Church. It's just been truly fascinating to see all the people who come to Yale, to New Haven, to study the Ives Papers. And they range from musicologists to performers to just fans of Ives. And some of the Ives fans are really so sincere and love the music so much. And we're happy for anyone with a serious interest in Ives to look at the papers.